Last Comanche Chief, The Life and Times of Quanah Parker, Chapter 2.
2. Comancheria. To our shame, the Indians have appeared very early, making their raids and murders, and the only company that has organized, has set very diverse objectives, has to fight Indians in many different locations in a manner that has augmented more and more the boldness of the barbarians that without injury commit all types of bad things. Editorial in a Monterrey, Mexico newspaper, 1840. At the time of Quanah's birth, about 1850, the territory known as Comancheria was part of the United States of America. Prior to that, much of the Comanche's territory had been claimed by the Republic of Texas, which had been established in 1836 following the fall of the Alamo to the Mexicans and the subsequent capture of the Mexican dictator, Santa Anna, by General Sam Houston and his forces. The Mexican threat to the settlers had ended for the moment. Houston's imprisonment of Santa Anna had succeeded in pressuring the Mexican Napoleon into signing documents that led to the independence of Texas. Mexico would never again menace the Texas territory that lay beyond the Navasota River, but the Comanches still controlled Comancheria, regardless of which flag the Texans flew over their capital. The Comanches' lands reached from the plains and mountains of what is now south-central Colorado to the Pecos region of Texas, and from west of the Pecos River to the cross timbers of Texas on the east, and it included western Oklahoma and parts of SAS. Since the Comanches also controlled all of the Texas Hill Country and the Nueces River area, it was indeed a large portion of the southern plains that became known as Comancheria. The name Comanche itself had been Hispanicized by Spanish authorities in New Mexico from the Ute Comanche, meaning anyone who wants to fight me all the time. Comancheria's boundaries were never entirely clear because of the ebb and flow of war and peace between scattered bands of Comanches and other tribes. These nomadic warrior hunters still had the unique freedom of going where the grass was greener, and dominance over land rich in water, timber, and game was worth the sacrifice of many of their young men. The Utes had reason to call the Comanches anyone who wants to fight me all the time. Comanches and Utes had been warring for years over who had the right to live and hunt in South Park, a lush valley in the Rockies between the Arkansas and the South Platte rivers. In 1852, with yet another Comanche-Ute battle impending, Kit Carson and Will Drannon, both of whom were friendly with the band of Comanches involved, were invited by Chief Chpt to side with the people against the Utes. Carson said that he would like to oblige, but that he would prefer to watch from the sidelines, since he had never witnessed such a battle before. Chpt agreed, proud of his opportunity to prove Comanche superiority. Carson and Drannon had fought Utes on numerous occasions and knew full well the ferocity with which the coming battle would be waged. In his book, 30 Years on the Plains and in the Mountains, Drannon described what ensued. At the first beat of the drum, warriors emitted war whoops and quickly lined up on their side of the stream. The Utes formed a similar line on the opposite side. Drums ceased until after each war chief had passed along in front of his men. Then the drums beat again, followed by a rain of arrows from either side. Of all the war whoops I ever heard, they were the most savage, and the more noise the Indians made, the harder they would fight. Among the Comanches was one Indian in particular that I saw victorious, but he got badly used up during the day. That evening after eating, I went over to his wick up and found him sitting there, bloody from head to foot, with a large cut on one cheek, another on one side of the head, and numerous other wounds. He had not even washed the blood from his face or hands, but was sitting there telling his squaw and children how Utes he had killed during the day, apparently as cool and unconcerned as though nothing had happened to him. But he was not able for duty the next day and died about 10 o'clock. In spite of the loss of many of their men, the Comanches won the battle on the third day. South Park now belonged to the people. The victors held a great war dance and celebration and returned the next day to their camp along the Arkansas River. A large part of the continuing success of the Comanches in such battles was that they were among the first tribes to acquire the horse in the early 1700s, and as a result of their superior horsemanship, they rarely lost to any other tribe. The Kiowas, although outnumbered by the Comanches, were also formidable, so out of mutual respect, these two tribes in time built a lasting alliance. The Comanches also eventually made peace with the Cheyenne after several years of hostilities, but in spite of their victory in 1852, they never achieved a lasting settlement with the Utes. Intertribal warfare, of course, was traditional, far more threat. Inning to the Indian way of life in Comancheria were the inroads, being made by invading whites, settlers like the Parkers, among less savory sorts of intruders. From 1821 to 1836, Texas had been a province of the state of Mexico, and so was at that time to a American citizens a foreign country. Mexico's generous immigration. Laws had attracted all types of people, the majority of them fiercely ethnocentric and exceedingly hostile to non-Anglo-Celts, Catholics, and a centralized authoritative form of government. The Comanches, ironically, were responsible for Mexico's opening of Texas to American settlers by thoroughly defeating the Mexicans and the Spanish before them. The people had prevented widespread Hispanic settlement of Texas. So Mexico, in an effort to encourage a buffer zone of Anglo-American colonists between the Comanches and the northern provinces of present-day Mexico, enticed Americans and small numbers of Europeans and Mexicans to settle in Texas. Hispanic civilization had virtually withdrawn from Comancheria after the massacre at San Saba Mission in 1758, during which Father Santiesteban was beheaded while kneeling at the altar in prayer. The Celts, Irish, Welsh, Scots, and Anglos English who immigrated to Texas by way of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, and other primarily southern states were not to be dissuaded from their goal of possessing the land, whatever it took. The Spanish settlers who had fled from Bucareli in 1778 never returned, but those who survived Comanche attacks like the one on Parker's Fort in 1836 drifted back to their farms and put down roots. And not only did the Anglo-Celts stay on the land, they originated a new tactic for fighting Comanches not since before. The decline of Spanish power in the latter part of the 18th century had an offensive war been waged against the people. Now Texas's white warriors decided to go on the warpath themselves. Conflicts between invading whites and Indians were common and would soon lead to all-out war between the settlers and all Indians on the Texas frontier, in spite of the fact that many whites and Indians had formed friendly relationships. Hundreds of the settlers were squatters, helping themselves to the land without title. Thousands had come to Texas to escape indebtedness in what was then a very bad economic climate in the United States, and they included gamblers, rustlers, outlaws, and other predatory types. Among the rougher element in the early days of the Republic were the lead miners who had immigrated to Texas from mines in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. They were a tough, bad lot and would brook no insult. Anyone who offended them had to fight a duel with Bowie knives or lose his honor, one or both. Combatants usually died. Small farmers, speculators, and a few property people made up most of the population, and all of them had to be good with knives and guns. Survival demanded it. These rough frontier men formed quick, incisive opinions on everything and everyone. They checked a stranger's eyes he had to pass inspection, or life would be hard for him in old Texas. Also, a man needed friends or partners or family because single. Men on the move were assumed to be up to mischief. Historian Louis J. Wortham has provided a description of this group as it existed in the East Texas town of Nacogdoches. There was an element which had infested this region ever since 1806, the so-called border ruffians and other desperate characters, fugitives from justice, gamblers and sharpers, and idlers among the younger generation of the Mexicans. A traveler with any amount of money on his person would be likely to disappear in the territory between the Sabine and Nacogdoches in those days. And the true explanation of his disappearance would generally be that he had been waylaid, robbed, and murdered by some of these outlaws. Along with this motley crew were the men who had migrated to Texas from river towns or small farms hacked out of southern forests. The Parkers exemplified these men. English, Irish, and Scottish blood coursed through their veins in a constant reminder that they were fighters. Among other things, a man had to fight the land itself. He had to spend his energy cutting trees and clearing land. He had to break the sod with a mule and crude plow. He had to build a house. He had to fight the weather and the constantly changing political situation. But most of all, the new immigrant to Texas had to fight the wilderness, and that meant the men of the wilderness as well. This demand was not that unfamiliar. Tribal warfare was hardly a distant memory to the Scots and Irishmen. The Scottish and Irish descendants of the Celtic warriors, who had once repelled Roman legions and Viking hordes, were among the greatest fighting men the world has ever seen. Unlike the majority of Spanish and Mexican soldiers, the Anglo-Celtic frontiersmen of Texas, like the Mexican vaqueros, did not shrink from the Comanche terror. While Comanche warriors rode arrogantly in front of the early Texas frontiersmen, the blood of the tribal warrior beat in the breasts of those white men too, although they were at first far out, horsed by the Comanches. In tribal fashion, the Texans united. Better horses were brought into Texas from Kentucky. Arabian and thoroughbred sires were crossed with Spanish Mustangs. And the Texans slowly developed a hardy horse that thrived on grain, but could maintain his strength and stamina by grazing on the trail. Because the regular army could not be sure whether Mexico would attempt to retake Texas, their services were required elsewhere, so the settlers had to rely on themselves and on the Texas Rangers. Since the strength of the Rangers lay in their horses and their horsemanship, many settlers parted with their best horses to mount the Rangers. They were fighting for survival, and old Texans believed that Mexicans and Indians should be cut down like trees of the forest if they got in the way of that survival. The fate of the peaceful Cherokees is an example of this policy. A rumor was spread that the agricultural Indians were planning an alliance with Mexico against the Texans, and the Cherokees were driven out of East Texas before they could harvest their crops. They tried to resist, but their fields were burned, and they lost heavily in terms of men and property. Their reward for their efforts to adapt to the white man's ways was exile to Arkansas and Indian Territory. It was clearly the intention of the political leaders of Texas, with the notable exception of Sam Houston, to drive all Indians out of the Lone Star Republic. The Rangers were a special breed. When they took the field, they fought like Silas Parker, who, though sure of death during the attack on Parker's fort, fought until his strength left his body. Even so, U.S. Army officers were often grudging in their respect for the Rangers because of their disheveled appearance and their lack of uniformity. Every Ranger dressed as he pleased, according to Nelson Lee, a Texas Ranger captured by the Comanches. The Rangers' usual habiliments were buckskin moccasins and overalls, a roundabout and red shirt, a cap manufactured by his own hands from the skin of a coon or a wildcat, 3 revolvers and a Bowie knife in his belt, and a short rifle on his arm. 5 like a Comanche, a Ranger fought as an individual. Orders were seldom given in military fashion. Instead, men led by example and words were few. The Rangers were mostly young and single, and the trail offered 1,000 thrills. Like the Comanches, Rangers learned to attack the enemy on his own ground, and as they engaged the Comanches again and again, their tactics improved. They learned to think like Comanches. Like Comanche warriors, Rangers were always on the lookout for a fast horse with a sense of the land and the creatures of the wilderness. A good horse could take his master over great distances at top speed while avoiding prairie dog holes and other natural hazards. He was more than just a mount. He was the Ranger's companion by day and his sentry at night. John Jack Hayes is a prototype of the Rangers who won the respect of the Indians. Brave and steady in all situations, Hayes was a great warrior who led by example. Nelson Lee describes young Captain Hayes in 3 years among the Comanches. He was a slim, smooth-faced boy, not over 20 years of age, and looking younger than he was in fact. In his manners, he was unassuming in the extreme, a stripling of few words, whose quiet demeanor stretched quite to the verge of modesty. Nevertheless, it was this youngster whom the tall, huge-framed, brawny armed campaigners hailed unanimously as their chief and leader when they had assembled together in their uncouth garb on the Grand Plaza of Bexar. As he was, he had already exhibited abundant evidence that though a lamb in peace, he was a lion in war. 6, young. For over a century, Comanche raiders had left their villages in the most remote areas of Comancheria to make raids on New Mexican and Mexican frontiers. The isolated ranches of northern Mexico were traditional favorites of the people. Docu. Ments from various Mexican provinces of the desert north reveal the extraordinary feats of Comanche and Kiowa warriors during such raids. 6 of September, Agualeguas. The primary judge of peace to the prefect of the district of Cadereyta Jimenez. Repeatedly news has come at Rancho Botelas to me from the countrymen and neighbors of a large number of barbaric Indians in this jurisdiction. There are 200 barbarians. At 3 in the afternoon yesterday, they attacked this ranch, taking 2 families captive, leaving dead 1 man, capturing another man, 5 women, and 2 children. These barbarians, having continued their march along the Royal Road, Camino Real, until almost to this villa, countermarched for the Rancho de Cochinitos, which they attacked at dawn. The Indians killed another man, while the rest of the families escaped to a corral, which had been constructed for defense. The enemies sacked the majority of the dwellings, leaving the unhappy residents in the most abject misery. Because these barbarians are not encountered by mounted men, they unleash their savagery on the unhappy, defenseless ones. Without any way to help each other in joining together in pursuing the enemy, for lack of being able to mount men in effect, there was not a horse to be found. I am reduced to defend the population with neighbors that on foot have been able to come together. In a letter to the sub-prefect of the District of Monterey, the primary judge of peace for the area surrounding Villadama described the theft of 200 or more horses from a ranch in the region. The judge also reported that 60 Indians had left Villadama and headed toward Monterey. As there were evidently enough horses in that area to mount a citizen militia, the judge of Villadama optimistically reported that it was possible for the ranchers and vaqueros to unite and defeat the Indians. On September 8, 1840, the primary judge of peace of Agualeguas sent a letter to the prefect of Cadereyta Jimenez, containing a long list of depredations by the Comanches, Kiowas, and their allies. After telling his superior that the battle begun on the 6th was still raging, the judge gave the following account of the actions of the Barbaros. I took charge by ordering all families to gather at the ranches of Puntiagudo, Nogales, Escondida, and Cieneguita. At last, all of the families had gathered. At that moment, I wrote to the judge of peace at Saralvo, asking him to notify the people in that region of the danger and guard against a surprise attack on those ranches, as at those times their defenses are less than on full alert. And according to this, at the same hour, I ordered the village to be placed in a state of defense, placing all of the inhabitants in the avenues of the town. At dawn today, I sent out scouts to explore the trails north of the village. At 8 that morning, a delegation from Puntiagudo arrived. At daybreak, the Indians had stolen a drove of mules. Right away, another band attacked the Maldonado ranch, but as the people already knew the Indians were in the country. The families had all gathered behind a wooden fort and gave such a strong resistance that the Indians retreated. Before I arrived here, a neighbor came on foot looking for a boy who that morning had been lost. At dawn on the 7th, 46 mounted men left, looking for the lost boy. Toward the east, another 10 men also left to look for the mule lost the night before, which they found and corralled on the Zacatosa ranch. At 9 that morning, while the 10 men were in the corral, a woman arrived, almost naked, with a 2 or 3-year-old girl, and she said that she is from Botelos, jurisdiction of Saralvo, that her name was Maria del Carmen Garcia, that her father Vicente Guerra and her sister were killed in the same house. The Indians took her, another sister, and her mother with them. After walking a short distance, she saw approaching her an Indian who had her child, making her believe he was going to kill her. He then came up quickly and said, "Take your daughter," and he gave her the child, saying there were houses near, and he would come back. Soon he returned to her, saying he was not an Indian but a Christian blonde, slim, thick beard, and he carried her until they came to the royal road where it leads from Mir to this house, assuring this woman that the most of that party in which the blonde warrior rode were gentlemen, but as a whole, the Indians were barbarians. 8. On October 7th, 1840, the judge of peace at Marin wrote to his superior that on the previous day, vaqueros from Rancho del Palo Blanco not only defended their ranch, but put the Indians into full flight. As the Mexicans followed the Comanches trail, they found many of the Indians' belongings abandoned in an attempt to increase their speed. Thus, the Mexicans achieved one of their earliest victories over the Comanches and their allies. In 1840, within months of the Mexican triumph, the Texans learned that they, too, could whip the Comanches. Comanche. Power had not been tested north of Mexico since New Mexico Governor Don Juan Bautista de Anza's punitive expedition from Santa Fe in the late 1700s had resoundingly defeated the northern Comanches. Spanish cavalry had for brief periods been an effective deterrent against the early Comanche horsemen, but from the latter 1700s until Spain's expulsion from Mexico in 1821. Spain could provide little money to protect the frontier because of the drain on the royal treasury from European wars and the extravagance of the Spanish court. While brave Spanish settlers had been denied arms by the crown, the Anglo-Celtic warriors of early Texas were not dependent upon a distant government for guns and ammunition. Vociferously democratic, Texans considered it their right as men born and bred in America to bear arms. Once the white warriors secured good horses and learned to ride like Mexicans, the odds evened out. The long rifles of the Texans were deadly at a far greater range than flint-tipped arrows, and though the Rangers fought individually, they had the advantage of a sense of going into battle as a clan or unit rather than depending on one's individual medicine as the Indians did. Open hostilities between Anglo-Texans and the people did not begin in earnest until attacks like the one on Parker's Fort in 1836 occurred. If the Texans were angry about Comanche raiders stealing horses or killing cattle on the scattered farms and ranches along the frontier, the capture of their women and children was the last straw, demanding something more than haphazard retaliation by the Rangers. In an attempt to impress upon the Comanches that Texans had sovereign rights over all vacant lands,